All right, y'all, we're going to get into the seventh lesson in the seventh period of APUSH. We are getting into the aftermath of World War I. We're really getting into one of the biggest issues, which is not so much the battlefield of World War I, but what is America's role now that we've entered World War I? We've kind of broken that Washingtonian premise of staying fully neutral. And then two, what should America's role be in creating these things? So you're really going to see how did America grow into a world power in period 7? We've certainly started to see that since the increase of imperialism. And then also now in the post-World War I world, there are going to be some reactions to this at the home front. It's not as simple as we make agreements and we move on. So after the end of World War I, you have this big question of what do you do with those states that lost? What do you do with a post-war Germany? Germany is going to be divided up, as you can see here in the purple on one end over here where it says Germany, and over on the far side. Then you have these striped areas, which are the leftovers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You see down below as well, Romania is carved out. The Ottoman Empire is going to be gone. There's going to be massive changes and reshaping of who controls what land. Also, if you look at the purple states in the middle, over to where you see the word France, that area, the Alsace-Lorraine, is going to be stripped from Germany and given to France and part of reparations. There's going to be a lot of economic value there. And on the eastern side, you're going to see the creation of the state of Poland. And Poland is going to divide up Germany between East Prussia and Germany are going to be cut off from each other in order to give the Poles access to a port, a shipping port here. But this is going to be one of the biggest issues that's going to be revisited when we look at the rise of people like Adolf Hitler in the rise of World War II. So when we come and look at this question of how does the war end and what America's role and push forward is, one big question you really have to consider is America joins the war very, very, very late. For the most outset of the war, the United States is in for less than a year, 9 months in some cases, because it takes so long to mobilize. By the post-Zimmerman telegram, once America has finally agreed and joined the war and got soldiers overseas. So we did not serve in any long-term capacity, but it's very clear that this was one of the biggest tipping points in the outcome of the war. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson has a very different view than the leaders of Britain and France and Russia, who have slogged throughout this war and have died in droves and droves and droves, and America being still relatively fresh coming into this conversation. Woodrow Wilson really saw moral diplomacy as the way to end the issues that plagued the start of World War I, which would be like imperialism, militarism, if you remember the main causes of World War I, as well as getting into this idea of nationalism. Woodrow Wilson creates this plan called the 14 Points, which is based on this idea of a more progressive outlook on nationalism, national identity, and self-determination. Trying in an attempt, for many people, they believe World War I was the war to end all wars. However, we know that World War II was obviously coming in many other issues throughout the 1900s. And so despite it being a noble advancement, they fail to do so. This idea is really going to be based in something that we start seeing in the United States going forward. Can the government solve the problems, or is the government the problem? When we get into the 1900s, we see a massive shift from period 7, period 8 of jostling back and forth between that question of yes and no. Is government the solution, or is government the problem? But Woodrow Wilson is definitely a proponent of government being used to solve international problems. When you look at the 14 points, you don't need to know all 14, but you can break them down to really 3 key markers. 1, create new nations out of these mega empires that have now been dissolved. Right? This is this emphasis on self-determination. Let the people themselves decide. Let these ethnic groups form themselves and create their own nation states. So you see all of these new countries carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire as well. 2, creating some set of international rules, freedom of free travel of the seas, elimination of secret treaties, reducing militarism, all of these things that are necessary for an avoidance of what caused World War I. But a lot of this is based on trust and merit. For example, the only way you would know a secret treaty exists if someone rats on that secret, so you are banking on goodwill and hoping that people will follow through with these issues. And the last thing is create some sort of governing body that if issues do arrive between nations, that we can hopefully solve these problems for the future. This entity is called the League of Nations, that hopefully countries from all around the world can solve issues diplomatically rather than resulting in war. And maybe, quite possibly, if this existed prior to World War I, that Wilson's hope was that this could have avoided the conflict that was brewing, that people saw, but could not come to an end. Woodrow Wilson takes these plans, he takes these ideals, he tries to bring them to the Paris Peace Conference, and we'll see how the other world leaders react. So by 1919, Woodrow Wilson has traveled over to the Paris Peace Conference, where many world leaders have come, but it largely boils down to just a few key influencers in this conversation, largely being the leader of the United States, the leader of France, the leader of England, and at this conversation, largely between the so-called big three that are there, hopes kind of start to bloom for Wilson to try to put these 14 points into effect and implement them as kind of the framework for the peace treaty in an attempt to avoid future global wars. But he was largely forced to compromise on largely all of his 14 points if he wished to pursue this League of Nations, which he held as his kind of crown jewel that he thought this achievement would solve future issues. The problem is when Wilson goes over and he brings his group with him, he doesn't bring a single Republican with him. And if you remember of how we've talked about the balance of power in the United States, the president does not have the ability to sign any treaties to force the United States to join any agreements. And the Republicans at the time control Congress. So even if he does make some sort of agreement with all of these leaders of Europe, it doesn't mean a single thing if the Congress shuts it down. More specifically, the Senate is the one that controls this. Now, this happened to work in our favor in the past in this course when you look at Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson has control, or the Democratic Republicans have control in 1803 once he makes an agreement, his envoys make an agreement with Napoleon for the Louisiana Purchase. This is not the case. There is a Republican-controlled Senate, and that's who he has to pass through. So this is going to be a major error on his part that's going to create problems moving forward. So when we get into actual provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, we're going to start seeing some matchup between what Wilson proposed and what actually happens, and we'll see really what's left. This treaty, like any treaty or major document, is going to be something that's going to have to be compromised. You have many completing factions. Yes, all of the members at this treaty are on the so-called winning side of this war. However, not all of them agree on what should happen after the war. And that's really that complexity that you would need to understand for anything. You look at the Constitutional Convention, based on the Declaration of Independence, compromises over slavery, amongst any issue, civil rights reforms. And so when you look at this, you really have to keep that in mind, right? For example, after World War I, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia were formed, but Germany's colonies in Africa are all split up by the winning European nations. So some nation states are given that preference. However, not all are. European nation states are given more preference than other ones in Africa or in various parts of Asia, whether the Middle East or Far East Asia. Ultimately, Germany is forced to accept the war guilt clause, which says that they are entirely guilty for starting and perpetrating the entire war. And as a result, they would have to pay for all of the damages and the chaos and the death that ensued. And so Germany is going to be spiraled into a severe hyper-depression, hyperinflation going to ensue, which is going to wreck the economy, the morale, which is essentially part of the intent, but it's going to breed massive resentment that allows for the rise of someone like Adolf Hitler. Woodrow Wilson was hoping to avoid this, and avoid this like retribution in his mind, as a way we could have peace without victory, that we could all walk away from this to try to build a better world rather than trying to get vengeance in any way, or someone else has to suffer any more than people already have from the war. The treaty did not mention anything in regards to free trade or freedom of the seas, like Wilson hoped. And despite for like this call to ending secret negotiations and secret alliances, this whole treaty was drafted in secret. Germany wasn't even invited to the Treaty of Paris. They were only invited when they were forced to sign the treaty. And if they didn't, they would have faced destruction. So there's mass resentment. This is not handled in this mass, open, democratic way. There's going to be a lot of layers to this question. And then when you look at even the physical or the geographic shape of Europe and how it changes before and after the war, you can even see some physical changes that are going to result in a lot of tensions in the near future. So this is a map of what Europe looked like before World War I. Take special notice to the eastern side of the map. We're going to see Russia here is going to change severely. Germany is going to change here severely. Austria-Hungary is going to change. On the bottom right-hand corner, the Ottoman Empire is going to change. And even the countries in the southeastern portion of Europe, like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania, are going to see some changes as well. After World War I, this push to dismantle these empires is going to cause for a massive geographic change. So watch on that eastern side. Boom. We have new countries all over the place. Whether it's the Baltic states, you see the creation of Poland. Notice I pointed this out earlier. Poland splits up the two territories of Germany and Eastern Prussia, which is part of Germany. They're not divided. They're divided so that Poland has access to the Baltic Sea. You see these Eastern European countries. So these empires are divided. Then you take a look also in the Far East. You see there that the far eastern part of Europe into Asia here, we have the Soviet Union has now formed, which was the Kingdom of Russia, right, with the Tsar and Tsarina. And in the middle of the war, they pull out, a communist revolution takes place, and now you have a massive communist state that is going to become our large rival post-World War II. When you flip into the Middle East here, right, we're also going to see some changes down there. You see a lot of consequences that we're not going to deal with at this point, but are going to be huge in period 8. We see the creation of Turkey and Syria and Iraq, and those are going to change. Persia is still in existence. They are going to change as well. Palestine there, right, under below that blue marker is there, which we know has been in the news a lot in 2025 and in 2026, right? And the issues with Israel, which is going to be forcefully created post-World War II, following the Holocaust. And so there are going to be changes in these immediate areas, but also understand that not everywhere changes, not everywhere gets freedom. And even if these areas do get freedom and a new country is formed, there are still going to be issues where ethnic groups are largely lumped together under a roof that they did not necessarily have consultation on. The big figures at the Paris Peace Conference ultimately agree to Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. However, most of his other principles have largely been gutted. Wilson gives up those other things to what he believes as the most centrally important. The League of Nations, again, is this international organization aimed at peacekeeping. If there is an issue, rather than resulting to war, that hopefully there is some diplomatic way of trying to solve them. A General Assembly of 27 different nations is created, and then a higher level executive council is there. So you will see the United States, in theory, France and England, amongst others, including Italy and Japan, and 4 other nations that are going to be elected. The League of Nations will have a court of international justice to solve international disputes. There will be arbitration. There will be economic sanctions on countries that violate this to try to settle conflicts rather than going into war. But the biggest piece of this agreement of the League of Nations that is going to cause tension on the home front is one article of the Treaty of Paris, and the article is Article 10. You'll see it written as Article X because the Roman numeral. And it said that any nation that is a member of the League of Nations must protect other members. All members of the League, no wavering no a subgroup of that. So if Japan is attacked, the United States, and the United States is a part of the League of Nations, then that is considered an attack on the United States. The Congress does not have control or say over if we go to war or not. That's going to be a big concern about the power balance in the United States. There are going to be times where the United States would then be forced to go to countries that they don't have an interest with or could counteract what the public want or have their interest with because they're a part of the League of Nations or a part of this agreement. And if they do agree to it and sign it, then power is largely going to be stripped away from parts of the American government, many people fear. So this becomes a big piece of contention once the debates start heading to the home front. So if we're evaluating if Woodrow Wilson was actually successful, you can take a look at this chart. You don't need to know Wilson's 14 points in their entirety, but you can understand a couple things. One, hoping to avoid future wars. Two, trying to champion like self-determination. And then three, the creation of a League of Nations. So most of his issues were not met in entirely. One, you could argue, the 13th, the establishment of independent Poland, true, which had access to the sea, the evacuation and restoration of Belgium from the Germans, and the restoration of all the French lands to France. There was a couple he had to compromise on. You'll see 9 through 12 there, which deal with self-determination in certain countries and how they're formed, and then others had to be abandoned in its entirety. So know that although Wilson comes in with these plans, he's not successful in getting them all agreed to. Ultimately, though, on June 28th, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed by Germany. They were forced to come to the Hall of Mirrors. In this meeting, you had all of these World War I veterans with severe deformities as a result of the war and wounds and needing facial reconstructions that were maimed, that forced the German leaders to walk through, and essentially this forceful signing. They didn't really have any other choice, or the Allies threatened to further pursue the destruction of Germany through military means. But ultimately, it was agreed to, it was signed, and World War I was officially over. But again, remember, just because the president has agreed to it or said they're going to agree to it, the president does not have the power to sign treaties or make agreements in totality in the United States. They can meet with leaders, they can orchestrate some details, but the Senate is the one that either confirms or denies it. I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the video, in the presentation, that Woodrow Wilson did not pull any Republicans with him at all. That's going to be a huge piece of contention because they're going to have very different views about the power balance of the country and the role of the United States in the world. Should America be the world police? Should America be involved in world affairs? Or should we go back to the Washingtonian ideals we've had since our very first presidency, where largely we have not violated this in almost any capacity, that the United States should be an isolationist nation? Should that be our foreign policy? Many senators are going to agree with that sentiment and disagree with Wilson, and so you're going to have one really weird effect despite this treaty being agreed to and Woodrow Wilson getting the creation of the League of Nations. Despite this being the brainchild of the President of the United States, and all of the major European nations joined the League of Nations and signed the treaties, the United States did not. Public policy polls showed that support for the treaty was there. However, senators who are controlling this debate did not want to accept Article 10. They were willing to amend it to keep the U.S. from being forced to fight overseas in foreign wars. And so although there are these attempts to what will be the precursor to the United Nations, that the United States is a massive part of today that comes after World War II, I love this political cartoon. This keystone that's supposed to hold it up and be the center of it, the brainchild of it, is not there. And so the United States is not involved in the League of Nations going forward. If an agreement was to be made and the United States was to join, 2/3 of the Senate would be needed for the U.S. to approve the treaty. You have some people that were a little bit off-put by the treaty, wanted to change slightly in the language for the League of Nations for them to agree to it. You also have some hardcore isolationist types like Henry Cabot Lodge that wanted major changes specifically to Article 10. And then you have people, that other Republicans that were like, in no way, shape, or form would they ever let the United States decide to join this league. So it's not just a yes or no question. There are levels to this, but he faces way too much opposition to be able to move like this. And so if you're thinking about like an essay question or understanding like a really complex or nuanced understanding of this issue, think about how might this be similar to Republicans in the lead up to the Civil War, or more importantly, during the Reconstruction period. Did everybody agree on the Reconstruction methods or the path for Reconstruction? No. Think about debates between Abraham Lincoln and the radical Reconstructions like Thaddeus Stevens, radical Republicans during Reconstruction like Thaddeus Stevens. Think about how then you insert a different type of Democrat with Andrew Johnson, who takes over after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, how his policies differ. And then throw in someone like General Grant, who eventually becomes the president, and how his policies relate to all of these things. There's a really complex weave there. You could answer it with a very straightforward answer to a DBQ, LEQ, SAQ question about this, but there is some nuance there to still get a little bit further. This cartoon, I think, sums up a lot of the debates and the reservations that are being had in the United States. For example, you see President Woodrow Wilson standing on the boat that represents the League of Nations, and there's leaks in the boat, there's waters flowing in. And then on the side, you have the reservations, people that are concerned, Uncle Sam, right? And it says, going to foreign entangling shores, we're going to get wrapped up in things. If you look at the language at the very bottom as well, it says you can't really blame him for wanting a life preserver. This cartoon really kind of illustrates how the isolationist versus internationalist or interventionist debate really became a problem for Wilson. He's not going to get Uncle Sam to jump in the sinking boat unless there's a life preserver, right? Unless there is some other thing in there that's going to provide him protection, he's not going to jump in wholeheartedly. And so Wilson's inability to get full domestic political support for this is one of the reasons why the League, metaphorically here, sinks. So as I've kind of not very subtly hinted at, this leads to the majority leader in the Senate, the Republicans control the Senate, to attack the Paris Peace Treaty and the League of Nations. And instead of compromising, Wilson tried to just pressure the Senate. He tried to go on a speaking tour throughout the country to try to push public sentiment against these senators, but it didn't do anything. He tried to do what he did in Paris to try to win people over. And despite it maybe being popular amongst people, it did not influence those that were actually making the decision. And on top of that, during this tour, Wilson had a stroke. He remained bedridden. There are accounts of him contracting the Spanish flu, the pandemic that strikes the world post-World War I. And so for the rest of his presidency, really his wife is kind of serving as the de facto president because we're waning into the final kind of months here before he's over. And so he's not able to leverage that strength really anymore. And he does not successfully win over those in the Senate. Woodrow Wilson is unable to really strike any compromises with the irreconcilable Republicans or those that have strong reservations, and they're able to largely defeat that treaty that comes across the Senate floor. Wilson is not able to get the 2/3 needed to pass it. As a result, America never signs the Treaty of Versailles that came out of the Paris Peace Conference. We never join the League of Nations. We have to sign our own individual treaty on the side. And so much so, the political fallout from this, I guess you could argue, is that by 1920, a Republican wins in a landslide victory. Like we are talking 75% of the Electoral College votes, which initials a call that Warren Harding used in his campaign slogan, what he referred to as a return to normalcy. And I want you, as you're looking at these results, think about what that call might mean. What was, quote unquote, normal pre-World War I? What did that look like? If you have to pause and think if you can come with yourself, foreign policy, What was America like largely before World War I? We were isolationists. We weren't interventionists. What was the United States like in terms of relation to businesses pre-World War I? Pre-progressive movement, the government was very pro-favorable business. These types of things are going to be what the Republicans are going to try to harp on and call on, and that's why you are going to see 60% of the popular vote going to Warren Harding and 76% of the electoral college votes going to Harding, and there's going to be a big swing in that political direction. So like I said, when we're looking at this map and we look at who actually joins the League of Nations, we see this map that is, I think, more telling than the one that's colorful. Look what countries don't join. The white are countries that do not join. You see the United States over on the left, right? You see Mexico, right? Large country there. You see Brazil. That massive, massive chunk of land is the Soviet Union. There's a couple countries in Africa. And so largely, we are one of the few countries that aren't in it. So if we're taking stock of everything in this video, what can it tell us about what we're going to see for the ending half of period 7? Despite the United States not being involved in World War I for very long, it still had a very meaningful impact. The U.S. Army tipped the balance during World War I and kind of pushed that over the edge for the Allies to win. And even though maybe the longest a U.S. soldier was overseas during the war was maybe 9 months due to issues with mobilization and length of travel, the U.S. still played a key role at the end, largely in the post-war period in the peacekeeping process, in the formation and the editing of the League of Nations, and with the Treaty of Versailles and impacting how that came out to be. During World War I, and as a result of World War I, there was an increased, unprecedented period of economic boom and government involvement that had not been seen up to this time period, whether it be to mobilize the war, for attempts at conscription and drafting, or for something that would bring about immediate change, whatever that movement was. We see changes happening during the World War I period, like the 18th Amendment, prohibition, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote federally. But the progressive movement is really going to die out with the 19th Amendment in 1919. There is a movement that is going to take place forward, but it's largely going to be pivoted towards Harding's pitch for a return to normalcy. The next generation of Americans, and even in Europe, specifically in France, are going to start seeing a group of artists and authors that dub themselves the lost generation. Kids that grew up during the war years, that lost their youth period, that lost their teenage years, which you would be in, right? You imagine if you're someone in France in 1914, right? And say you're 14 in 1914. By the time the war is over, right, and we'll say we flash all the way to 1920, you're 20 years old. You've essentially had to skip and give up your years from 14 to 20 years old, these formative years. You go to education, you become the man and woman you are today. You would start having these major movements and milestones in your life that maybe your friends, those people that are supposed to be with you, are now dead because of the war. And so really an anti-war sentiment is largely being seen, especially in the United States and in parts of Europe. So pro-war attitudes, not really that big. International, like interventionists, are not going to be as popular as isolationists are. And Americans really largely welcomed this policy of this, or this idea of a return to normalcy. And in Harding's address following his election, he says he promises not of heroics but healing, not of nostrums but normalcy, not revolutions but restoration. And with that, we end our look at today and we push ourselves into the 1920s, the latter half of period 7, as we start crushing our way through the end of the content to get ready for the AP exam. If you have any questions, always comment, reach out, let me know. Other than that, folks, happy studying.